So the DNC is over. And besides the spectacle that went on inside of the DNC, what was going on outside of the DNC brought a lot of people to question, what is Planned Parenthood doing outside of the DNC? What do they have to do with the Democratic National Convention? Well, if you know the history, they got a lot to do with it. We have to first start by asking, who was Margaret Sanger? And what did she have to do with Planned Parenthood? And how does it connect to the Democratic Party?
Margaret Sanger was the founder of the American reproductive rights movement.
Margaret Sanger was born Margaret Higgins on September 14, 1879, in Corning, New York. She came from a very large Roman Catholic family, having 11 siblings. After attending college, she studied to become a nurse.
Margaret Sanger was influenced by the experiences she had as a visiting nurse, where she met so many immigrant working mothers who were deeply impacted by unwanted pregnancies and forced, often botched miscarriages.
Most people attribute Sanger's interest in birth control to seeing what her mother went through. She had a total of 18 pregnancies. Her mother ultimately died at age 40 of tuberculosis.
Margaret married William Sanger in 1902 and moved to Greenwich Village, New York City a few years later. There she began her life's work advocating for birth control while also raising a family of 3 children.
Margaret Sanger came of age during the period of the Comstock Act. This was a statute that made it illegal to discuss, distribute materials, or provide women with anything related to birth control or contraception.
Sanger thought that the best way to change the law was to break the law. She launched the Woman Rebel, which promoted birth control, collecting the attention of the U.S. government, which immediately indicted her for publishing obscene materials. Instead of risking 20 years in prison, she flew the country and went into exile in England.
Sanger spent 1 year in England and returned to the United States in 1915 when the charges against her were dropped. A year later, she opened America's first birth control clinic in Brooklyn.
She called the press for interviews in which she announced the clinic, telling them it would be secret, essentially inviting police to come by. More than 400 women from the neighborhood came to that clinic. A few days later, the clinic was closed and Sanger and her colleagues were arrested. However, the clinic received coverage in all of the papers, and this was in the middle of World War I.
Sanger also went on to start a research institute dedicated to birth control, the first scientific journal dedicated to birth control, and a large advocacy organization. All of these pieces came together in 1942 to become what's now known as Planned Parenthood.
Sanger was deeply committed to finding a pill to help women control unwanted pregnancies.
During the 1950s, she brought together a coalition of philanthropists, scientists, and physicians to ultimately bring about the first birth control pill, which would be known as a Novid.
After more than a half-century leading the birth control fight, Sanger lived to see her main goals realized: the invention and FDA approval of a contraceptive pill in 1960, and the repeal of the Comstock Law by the Supreme Court in 1965. She died a year later on September 6, 1966.
Margaret Sanger wrote that a woman's body belongs to herself alone. It does not belong to the United States of America or any other government on the face of the earth. Sanger fought all her life to make this the case, and women today owe Sanger a great debt of gratitude for fighting this fight for herself and for generations to come.
As you can see, Margaret Sanger was just a saintly old woman who wanted to fight for the reproductive rights of women. And she believed that the woman's body belonged to her and her alone, not the government. But let's explore other thoughts that Margaret Sanger may have had. So the source that I'm going to be using to help us further understand who Margaret Sanger was comes from a book by Mark R. Levin, and that is called The Democrat Party Hates America. It says, one of the most avid and influential advocates of eugenics was Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, which has had deep ties to the Democrat Party for a century and has been funded with billions of federal taxpayer dollars for decades. Indeed, any present-day attempts to reduce the group's tax subsidies is met with howls of objections from congressional Democrats. Who was Margaret Sanger? Sanger has been celebrated as an early feminist and birth control pioneer, but she was much more than that. Sanger was an ardent racist. She spoke to the women's auxiliary of the Klan in New Jersey. She supported the forcible sterilization of unfit women, and Sanger made many documented racist declarations throughout her life. For example, she wrote, "Eugenics is the most adequate and thorough avenue to the solution of racial, political, and social problems." She argued that Birth control is not contraception indiscriminately and thoughtlessly practiced. It means the release of cultivation of the better racial elements in our society and gradual suppression, elimination, and eventually expiration of defective stocks, those human weeds which threaten the bloom of the finest flowers of American civilization. It also goes on to say, nonetheless, Planned Parenthood praised Sanger for decades, conferring its highest award, the Margaret Sanger Award, on a long list of recipients, including Hillary Clinton, who proudly accepted it. Not until 2000 did Planned Parenthood begin to distance itself finally and reluctantly from Sanger's racial eugenics, but only after a torrent of criticism. So, when you guys ask, what does Planned Parenthood have to do with the DNC? It has everything to do with the DNC because the whole Democratic Party's racial agenda, along with Margaret Sanger's Planned Parenthood, was to eradicate those deemed feeble minded, undesirable races, purify the American stock. So, this is who Margaret Sanger truly was. So, that is what the Democrat Party and the Planned Parenthood trucks being outside of the DNC have to do with this whole campaign. It's directly tied to the Democrat Party. And what's ironic to me is the name Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood sound like it should be a fertility clinic. Planned Parenthood. Shouldn't it be unplanned parenthood? I mean, wouldn't that make more sense? Since you're sleeping babies? I'm just going to say that for the sake of YouTube. Sleeping babies. But that's why the Planned Parenthood trucks were outside the DNC. A little history on Miss Margaret Sanger. Here's some additional food for thought. Don't you find it ironic how the very group of people that she deemed undesirable are the very group of people that vote for the party she's in favor of?